In this video, I'm going to describe a simple method for finding the sweet spot of a katana, that is, the optimal place on the blade to use for cutting. In Japanese swordsmanship, we're taught to cut with the part of the blade called the monouchi, which is loosely defined as 1/3 of the blade from the tip. This principle carries over into kendo, which is why the nakayui, the leather band, sits at about the 1/3 point of the length of the shinai's blade. It's one of the reminders that the shinai is a representation of a katana and not just a stick. On a katana, this general area would be considered the monouchi, but the question is, where exactly is the sweet spot? When you're dealing with a long object such as a bat or a sword that is striking something, one of the physical properties that come into play is something called the center of percussion. Let's say this ruler is floating freely. If you hit a stick exactly at the center of gravity, there will be only translational movement, that is, it moves sideways with no rotation. If you hit it off to one side of the center of gravity, it will start rotating in addition to moving sideways. The further away from the center of gravity you hit the stick, the more rotational movement and the less translational movement there will be. The center of percussion is the point where if you strike that object, the translational movement and the rotational movement cancel each other out at a pivot point. So if you happen to be holding a stick at that pivot point, then your hand should feel the least amount of movement. Until quite recently, it was thought that the center of percussion was the sweet spot, the place where the impact feels the best to the person holding the stick, or in our case, holding the sword. But research has shown that the center of percussion and the sweet spot are often not one and the same. That's because in practical situations, the stick isn't moving freely by itself. For example, a baseball bat isn't floating freely in space. Someone is swinging it. And when that's the case, it turns out the pivot point is actually outside of the bat, by several inches in fact. If you want to geek out on the details, I'll put a link in the description below to some research that goes into depth about the center of percussion versus the sweet spot. Fortunately, you don't need a complex formula to find the sweet spot on a katana. There's a handy trick to do that. Take a rod and then slide it from the suba toward the kisaki as you lift up the blade. Make sure you lift the blade high enough so that the suba is not touching the floor, only the sukagashira, the end of the handle. It also helps if the sukagashira doesn't slide across the floor. And remember, if you're using a shinken, please be careful. As you slide toward the kisaki, there'll be a tipping point at which the blade suddenly stands up vertically. And that's your sweet spot. Right there. This is the point at which the sword begins to balance with the cutting edge facing the target rather than facing sideways. That means that if you strike an object anywhere between the sweet spot and the kisaki, the sword naturally wants to point toward the object that it's in contact with. You can see why this would be important for an effective cut. On the other hand, if you strike a target between the sweet spot and the suba, the blade will have a tendency to veer away from the initial hasuji, the cutting line. It's also worth remembering that a katana is primarily designed for a pull cut, as are all curved swords. The curvature increases the sword's contact time with the target compared to a straight sword. So, if the initial contact with the target happens at the sweet spot, and the blade is being pulled across the target during the cut, then the blade will generally want to face the target that it's in contact with, all along the monouchi. Finding the sweet spot like this is a neat trick, but in practice you don't really need to define the sweet spot so precisely. There are various factors that will change where the sweet spot is for any particular cut, such as whether you're using 2 hands versus 1, or what kind of waza you're executing. However, it's interesting to see how the geometry of a katana affects the location of the sweet spot. If you have a wider blade, as measured from the ha to the mine, that moves the sweet spot closer to the kisaki. If you have a blade with a deeper sori, meaning a deeper curvature, that moves the sweet spot further away from the kisaki. And if you have a tip-heavy blade, that again moves the sweet spot closer to the kisaki. I have an iaito here that has virtually the same geometry as my shinken, both in terms of length and in terms of sori. It's only a few millimeters longer than my shinken, but it weighs 50 grams less. Just by handling the swords, even without a need to measure anything, I can tell my iaito is a bit more tip-heavy than my shinken. My shinken feels more well-balanced, despite being heavier. So if I apply the sweet spot test to both swords, I should find that the sweet spot is closer to the tip on the iaito compared to the shinken. I'm going to measure it 3 times each and mark them with a Sharpie pen. And for those of you who are mortified right now that I'm marking the shinken with a Sharpie, don't worry, it comes off cleanly with a bit of alcohol. So there you go. And then I'll do that again for the shinken. This is the iaito, and this is the shinken. And as you can see, sure enough, the sweet spot is further toward the tip of my iaito than my shinken. And I actually didn't have to measure that to know that the iaito was more tip-heavy. The senses are very attuned to that kind of thing. To a large degree, I think your body adapts to differences in swords instinctively. But it still may be interesting to you if you're an aficionado of Japanese swords to know how the geometry of the blade can affect its balance. And knowing the location of the sweet spot on your katana may give you a better understanding of why certain kata are performed the way they are, or why certain swords are easier to cut with when doing tameshigiri.